In the intelligence failures class of events, the 1973 fiasco is certainly one of the most significant, equal to that of Pearl Harbor and Barbarossa. But to understand the sophistication of the Egyptian deception ahead of the Yom Kippur War, it is essential to know that the Egyptian military thinking underwent a quiet revolution beginning in 1969, while Israeli strategic thinking remained largely stagnant. The Israelis continued to view Arab military performance through the lens of the 1967 war. Not only did the Israelis underestimate the Egyptians' capacity to learn, but they also miscalculated the speed with which their army could train and prepare for the next round. Israel did not expect the Egyptian army to be ready before 1975 or 1976. In the wake of the 1967 Six-Day War, Egypt embarked on a bold campaign of self-reassessment. Determined to never experience another such debacle, its leadership initiated sweeping reforms throughout 1967 and 1968. A wide-ranging purge removed senior officers deemed incompetent or overly politicized, clearing the path for a new generation of disciplined, results-driven commanders. These fresh officers were determined to ensure that the humiliation of 1967 would never recur. One key innovation was a shift in mindset. Officers were now encouraged to study the Israelis in depth, their tactics, psychology, and even to speak their language. On the evening of October 24, 1972, President Anwar Sadat convened Egypt's Armed Forces Supreme Council at his Giza residence to declare his decision to end the no peace, no war status quo that had lasted since early August 1970, when the war of attrition ended. The defeat of June 1967 made both our enemies and our friends doubt that we would ever fight again. As a result, every solution presented to me is based on that assumption. Our commitments are being questioned, but I am not prepared to accept defeatist solutions or surrender. I will not sit at the table with Israel while we are in such a humiliating position, because that would be surrender. In front of our people, our enemies, and our allies, we must prove with determination and careful planning that we are capable of sacrifice, that we can stand up, fight, and change the situation with whatever means we have. The time for words is over. We have reached a breaking point. From now on, we must act with what is in our hands. We must follow this plan and set the region on fire. Only then will words have real meaning and value. Sadat defined the goal of the war simply to break the ceasefire and spark an international crisis. On that basis, the war planners shaped its overall concept. The strategic aim was to disrupt the existing balance of power in the region and to challenge Israel's sense of security and the assumptions behind its military doctrine. The plan called for an offensive operation to liberate the occupied land in stages, in line with the armed forces' capabilities. It also aimed to inflict the greatest possible losses on Israel, in both personnel and equipment, to convince it that the continued occupation of Egyptian territory would come at an unbearable cost. And in this master plan, Sadat would rely on an extraordinary asset, a man who would become the ultimate weapon of deception. Dr. Ashraf Marwan, who walked into the Israeli embassy in London with an irresistible offer. But beneath the surface, Marwan was playing a far more dangerous game. In August 1971, President Sadat convened a select group of generals at his summer residence, officers who would play a central role in preparing for the Yom Kippur War. According to Field Marshal Abdelghani El-Ghamasi, Sadat opened the meeting with a clear message. "I am warning you against routine military thinking. The enemy expects us to follow that path. Our victory must be built on surprise." That surprise would strike at the heart of Israeli intelligence. In Tel Aviv, military leaders operated under a fixed assumption that Egypt would not go to war without advanced air power, and Syria would not act without Egypt. This belief became so deeply rooted in Israeli thinking that it earned a name of its own: the concept. A theory that shaped every strategic decision, and one Sadat's plan was designed to exploit. The surprise attack in the October War, 1973, was seen as a great blow to Israel's pride and an intelligence failure. But the Israeli intelligence agencies were not the only ones that failed to anticipate the Yom Kippur War. U.S. intelligence was also watching Israel's Arab neighbors, and it failed to warn of the attack that threatened the very existence of one of America's closest allies. In the words of Richard Betts, an American political scientist, American intelligence, with its vast panoply of sophisticated intelligence collection mechanisms, made virtually all the same mistakes as the Israelis. In fact, the story is even worse. Despite an abundance of information on impending hostilities, U.S. intelligence agencies not only failed to see an attack coming, but actually predicted that there would be no war. Charles Allen, a CIA official at the time, admitted, "Even today, I feel personally seared by my failure and the agency's failure to warn of the Middle East War of October 1973. The indicators were there, but we failed to act on what were painfully obvious indicators, which we saw clearly ex post facto, that major conflict was about to erupt in the Middle East." There had been many warnings, both strategic and tactical, yet most intelligence assessments still judged an attack to be unlikely. One example was a CIA report issued on October 5th, just one day before the war began. The exercise and alert activities underway in Egypt may be on a somewhat larger scale and more realistic than previous exercises, but they do not appear to be preparing for a military offensive against Israel. The IDF's swift victory in the Six-Day War bred overconfidence and led to a deep underestimation of Arab military capabilities. Egyptian soldiers were dismissed as primitive, undisciplined, and incapable of handling sophisticated equipment or carrying out coordinated operations. This misjudgment played directly into Egypt's hands, allowing it to achieve what analysts later called a performance surprise. The Egyptian army demonstrated effective planning, rigorous training, and strong battlefield discipline, defying Israeli expectations. The Egyptians were the only true keepers of the flame of knowledge throughout the entire planning period. They deceived both friend and foe alike, withholding information even from their closest allies until the final moments. They had studied their enemy well. They understood the psychological blind spots within Israeli intelligence, particularly the tendency to underestimate Arab military capabilities. They also exploited Israel's heavy reliance on reservists, which required early warning, political approval, and time to mobilize. Israeli intelligence assumed they would have at least 48 hours of advance notice before any full-scale attack, enough time to prepare. But the timing of Egypt's assault during Yom Kippur disrupted mass communication and delayed reserve mobilization. Egypt also understood that a prolonged conflict could strain Israel's economy, wear down public morale, and increase pressure for a political resolution. Central to Egypt's deception was its understanding of Israel's air superiority and the fear it instilled. The Israeli Air Force was a strategic weapon capable of inflicting devastating punishment. Israel's punishment doctrine didn't stop at targeting enemy forces. It aimed to strike deep into enemy cities, forcing adversaries to shift resources from offense to defense. Israeli intelligence believed that no Arab nation would risk war unless it had the capability to neutralize Israeli air power from the outset, specifically by targeting all Israeli airfields simultaneously. Their assessment was that Egypt wouldn't reach that level of capability until at least 1975. This false assumption gave Egypt the strategic space it needed to plan and strike first. The Egyptians, aware of the airfield problem, devised an alternative solution: denying Israel air superiority would be enough. This approach also served their deception strategy. Egypt imported large numbers of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Israeli military intelligence assumed the SAMs were part of a defensive air shield to repel Israeli attacks. What they failed to realize was that these SAMs would be used to create a protective shield to protect Egyptian ground forces advancing into the Sinai. Egypt understood that Israel needed to see its troop movements along the Suez Canal as routine. In 1973 alone, Egyptian forces mobilized and demobilized 22 times before the war actually began. Units were repeatedly moved to the canal, tank ramps were built, and openings were carved into defensive earthworks, all clear signs of preparation for an attack. In May 1973, the IDF responded to one of these alerts by mobilizing at a cost of $20 million, only for Egypt to stand down once again. After that, the trap was set. Israeli intelligence personnel began weighing the economic cost of false alarms rather than focusing on the mounting warning signs. Instead of passing on raw indicators to political leadership, they filtered their reports through cost-benefit assumptions that weren't theirs to make. Egyptian planners devoted significant effort to deceiving U.S. and Israeli aerial and satellite reconnaissance. They assumed American satellites and Israeli aircraft were monitoring their movements and developed strategies to avoid detection, either by masking activity or timing it precisely. Crucially, they synchronized key preparations with the known dead periods in U.S. satellite coverage. While the exact orbits of the KH-8 Gambit satellites were classified, it is widely believed that Egypt had obtained this information. Armed with this knowledge, the Egyptian military would pause or camouflage sensitive activities during anticipated satellite overflights, resuming movement only when the skies were blind. One example when a senior CIA imagery officer, Dino Brugioni, recounted that the Egyptians were playing a shell game with the missile sites to confound Israeli and U.S. reconnaissance. One day, a SAM-2 site would be observed. The next day, its equipment had been moved out. The following day, SAM-3 equipment would be installed at the same location, causing great confusion for U.S. intelligence analysts trying to map Egypt's SAM network. This constant shuffling of air defense units ensured that no recon flight ever saw the full picture. Secretary of State William Rogers was briefed in September 1970 on how Egyptian SAMs popped in and out of existence on successive days, making up-to-the-minute tracking nearly impossible. When the war began, Israel's planned aerial surveillance and air support attacks were badly surprised by SAMs in places they didn't expect. In fact, the Egyptians had established an impressive aerial umbrella all along the canal by October 1973, a mix of SAM-2, SAM-3, and mobile SAM-6 batteries, which deterred Israeli pre-war reconnaissance flights entirely. By denying aerial observation and playing hide-and-seek with key assets, Egypt ensured that even if the US or Israel attempted last-minute reconnaissance, they would either not see the real deployments or be unable to interpret them correctly. Egypt's evasion tactics extended even to seemingly mundane activities. For example, in September 1973, the Egyptian army undertook a maintenance campaign where scores of tanks and armored vehicles were sent to repair workshops near the canal, allegedly due to breakdowns. To outside observers, this looked like a rash of mechanical failures plaguing Egypt's armor. In reality, those tanks were fully operational and quietly parked in assembly areas closer to the front, ready to join the offensive. The ruse was so effective that Israeli intelligence interpreted the convoys of tanks heading to the front for repairs as a sign of Egyptian weakness. This carefully timed choreography of alerts and lulls misled Israeli intelligence and conditioned them to dismiss subsequent real movements as drills. As historian Abraham Rabinovich writes, the Egyptians brilliantly orchestrated their activities to fall in the gaps of Israeli and American vision, both literal and figurative. In the war's aftermath, US and Israeli analysts alike marveled at the operational security and deception that had neutralized their surveillance. Former CIA Director William Colby noted that the Egyptians' movements had been so well timed and concealed that they denied us the unmistakable indicators we relied upon. Egypt didn't just deceive on the battlefield, it deceived in headlines. The media became an extension of military planning, with carefully crafted narratives designed to mislead, delay, and disarm the judgment of Israeli intelligence, foreign diplomats, and even Egypt's Arab allies. They emphasized the supposed decline in Egyptian military readiness following the expulsion of Soviet advisors. In reality, once the Soviets had left, the Egyptians quietly made critical improvements and modifications to their equipment, changes that would have been difficult under direct Soviet oversight. The T-34 tank, for instance, was upgraded to travel 4,000 kilometers on its tracks instead of just 1,000. Modifications to SAM systems, radar equipment, and electronic countermeasures were kept hidden from Israeli intelligence and only became apparent once the war began. The Egyptian Navy announced retraining efforts in mine-laying operations, claiming poor performance, but in reality, it was laying mines to blockade Israeli ports. Meanwhile, circulated false reports that 2 submarines were undergoing maintenance in Pakistan. In truth, those submarines had already deployed, quietly taking positions to help enforce a maritime blockade. Sadat worked to maintain the illusion that Egypt was committed to a diplomatic path. He repeatedly made public statements hinting at peaceful intentions or internal difficulties, while subtly warning of an inevitable confrontation. This ambiguity created strategic confusion, keeping foreign observers and Israeli intelligence uncertain about Egypt's true intentions. In February 1973, Sadat reinforced this narrative by dispatching his national security advisor Hafez Ismail on a diplomatic tour of major capitals, including Moscow, Bonn, London, and Washington, as part of what was dubbed a peace offensive. Ismail even met with U.S. President Richard Nixon at the White House on February 23rd, though no formal statement followed. By mid-March, it was clear the initiative had failed to yield results, but it had served its purpose. Egypt had appeared to pursue peace, buying time while quietly preparing for war. Official schedules and public statements were carefully curated to avoid raising suspicion. The Ministry of Defense even announced that soldiers could register for the pilgrimage to Mecca, scheduled for the end of October, just days before hostilities began. President Sadat told a foreign envoy he intended to attend the UN General Assembly in October, while a meeting between the Egyptian and Romanian defense ministers was scheduled for October 8th. Egyptian foreign ministry officials abroad were not recalled prior to the attack, including the foreign minister himself, reducing the risk of triggering Israeli or Allied intelligence alerts through intercepted diplomatic traffic. A sudden recall might have been interpreted as a signal that war was imminent. Egyptian troops along the Suez Canal were instructed to appear relaxed, walking without uniforms or weapons, fishing, and even swimming in the canal. Israeli forces watching from the Bar-Lev line interpreted these scenes as evidence of routine exercises rather than imminent war. On October 6th, Israeli soldiers recounted that the sunbathers disappeared before artillery barrages began hammering the Bar-Lev line. American officials relied too heavily on the overly optimistic assumptions of their Israeli counterparts. As the State Department's intelligence chief, Ray Klein, said, "Our difficulty was partly that we were brainwashed by the Israelis who brainwashed themselves." Israeli leadership remained deeply confident in their own military doctrine. They viewed Egyptian advancements as inconsequential and believed that their own superiority would allow them to fight the next war as they had the last. In doing so, they planned in a strategic vacuum, failing to account for how Egypt's new battlefield systems, especially anti-aircraft missiles and portable anti-tank weapons, would dramatically restrict Israel's freedom of action. Richard K. Betts, in his well-regarded study on surprise attacks, argued that over-reliance on the strategic belief that Egypt had no intention of going to war led analysts to discount tactical signals that challenged that assumption. Aharon Levran, a senior officer in Israeli military intelligence during the war, attributed the failure largely to Egypt's successful deception campaign and to the military intelligence's dependence on a single high-level source for early warning. As long as that source didn't report an imminent attack, analysts remained anchored to their low-probability assessment, reluctant to revise their view even as contradictory indicators emerged. According to military historian Professor John Ferris, there are typically two forms of deception in warfare: to mislead and to confuse. But Sadat introduced a third: sedation. By planting and reinforcing the so-called concept within Israel's military and political elite, he lulled them into a false sense of security. He fed Israel a slow, steady stream of carefully crafted signals to dull their alertness. But how did he do it? President Sadat decided to play the game on his own terms. Instead of the Mossad seeking out the vault of secrets, Sadat brought the vault directly to them. That very act unsettled and completely disoriented the heads of Israeli intelligence. According to Mossad director Zvi Zamir, Sadat pulled off a sophisticated deception by essentially bringing his presidential chamber to the Israeli chiefs, with Ashraf Marwan playing the role of the host. Zamir later admitted that Israeli intelligence had become enslaved to Marwan's reports, a dangerous single point of failure. General Shlomo Gazit, head of Israeli military intelligence, echoed that concern, remarking that Israel might have been better off never relying on Marwan at all. It's impossible to overlook the fact that Marwan was a walk-in. He offered his services to the Mossad in London in 1970 unprompted. He wasn't selected and recruited by them. This unusual initiative made him a potential Trojan horse planted by Egyptian intelligence. The testimonies of Mossad agents who followed Marwan's movements in London before and after meeting his case officer, Dubi Ashraf, also strengthened the theory. His confidence, after all, was quite astonishing, phoning the Israeli embassy directly, walking into meetings with Ashraf without so much as glancing over his shoulder, and carrying top-secret original documents in a bag to hand over to the Israelis. There were other signs suggesting Marwan was a deceptive asset. He provided Israel with the intelligence that shaped the foundation of their strategic concept, the belief that Egypt would not go to war without first acquiring advanced weapons like Scud missiles and long-range bombers. But when Sadat realized the Soviets wouldn't supply those weapons, he moved ahead with a limited war anyway. Marwan, who was deeply embedded in Sadat's inner circle, must have known of this shift, yet he never informed the Mossad. Instead, he allowed them to rely on a strategy that was no longer valid, blinding them to the growing body of contradictory evidence right in front of them.
סאדאת הודיע שהוא יתקוף כעבור חודש, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף כעבור 3 חודשים, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף עד סוף 71, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף עד סוף 72, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף בהתחלת 73, והייתה לנו התראה על מלחמה באמצע 73 בחודש יוני. היו לנו הרבה מאוד התראות.
Marwan misled Israel twice before the war, in late 1972, and again in April 1973, by warning of imminent Egyptian attacks that never came. The April alert, in particular, triggered a full-scale mobilization and sustained high alert, only for Israeli forces to stand down days later. These false alarms created a classic crywolf effect. In hindsight, these warnings appear to have been part of a calculated strategy. By provoking premature Israeli responses, Marwan have enabled the Egyptians to study Israeli mobilization patterns and refine their own operational planning ahead of the real attack. Perhaps the most astonishing detail concerns the timing of Egypt's actual decision to go to war. According to the memoirs of senior Egyptian officials, the first firm decision to launch the attack wasn't made until August 23, 1973. So how could Marwan have warned the Mossad of war back in 1972 and again in April 1973, before any decision had been made in Cairo? And even more striking, on August 28th, just 5 days after the war decision was finalized, Marwan was present at a meeting where President Sadat informed the Saudi king that war was imminent. Yet, Marwan reported to the Israelis that Egypt had postponed its war plans. If Marwan wasn't deliberately misleading the Israelis, why withhold such a critical shift in strategy? Eli Zera, head of Israeli military intelligence at the time, wrote in his memoirs that the fact that Marwan concealed crucial information by failing to report this meeting to the Israelis shows that he was the jewel in the crown of the Egyptian deception plan.
Hello, hi. The pressure is building. There are lots of chemicals. I require a face-to-face with the top brass. I will be in London tomorrow.
The final act was as subtle as it was devastating. On the night of October 5th, Marwan called his Mossad handler from Paris, but didn't use the agreed-upon code word for war, Ashligan, the boiler, a term chosen to signal imminent eruption. Instead, he used a vague warning, lots of chemicals. A signal of tension, but not certainty, not enough to trigger a full alert. He then requested a personal meeting with Mossad chief Zvi Zamir in London, delaying the delivery of critical information by nearly 24 hours. And even then, Marwan misled him again, claiming the war would begin at sunset. But the attack came earlier, at 2 p.m. Those few hours proved decisive. They gave Egyptian forces the time they needed to cross the Suez Canal and establish a foothold before Israeli reservists could even reach the front. There's a saying, information is power. In the intelligence world, that usually means locking secrets away in a safe. But Sadat did the opposite. He opened the safe and let the Israelis look inside. What they saw appeared to be nothing more than small change, minor movements, scattered updates, fragments of plans. No big banknotes, no signs of war. And so they concluded, quite logically, that there was no war to prepare for. But this was the brilliance of the deception. As intelligence scholar Professor Michael Handel once wrote, "The ultimate deception is to conceal political and military intentions." Sadat didn't hide the safe. He emptied it of his true intentions and filled it with decoys. He used the power of information not to inform, but to sedate, and it worked. Israeli intelligence became overconfident, relying too heavily on a single trusted source, Marwan, who ultimately misled them at the most critical moment. As military historians Elliot Cohen and John Gooch later observed, the Israeli failure stemmed not just from analytical mistakes, but from over-reliance on one source who failed when it mattered most. Sadat didn't rely on a single trick. He orchestrated a layered campaign built on 3 strategic deceptions, each more daring than the last. The first was designed to lull the Israeli army into a false sense of calm, ensuring a smooth Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal. It culminated on Wednesday, October 3, 1973, when Egyptian intelligence concluded that Israeli forces had fallen into a deep slumber. The second ruse was psychological. It was designed to provoke Israel into starting the war themselves. To set this trap, Sadat dispatched Ashraf Marwan to London to meet Mossad chief Zvi Zamir with a dramatic warning: Egypt would go to war tomorrow. To understand the brilliance behind this move, one must go back to September 25, 1973, when King Hussein of Jordan secretly flew to Tel Aviv to warn Golda Meir of a looming Egyptian-Syrian attack. The king could have sent a messenger, but chose to come himself, signaling the seriousness of the threat. Sadat took note. By sending Zvi Zamir's most valuable source, a man with unfiltered access to Egypt's inner circle, Sadat ensured that the warning would land like a thunderclap. Only Zamir, a direct subordinate to the prime minister, could deliver such news to Mir in the dead of night, just hours before Yom Kippur began. The goal was to create shock, confusion, and panic, to push Israeli leaders into launching a preemptive airstrike, thereby making Israel appear as the aggressor. This would shift the moral and diplomatic burden onto Tel Aviv, alienating global allies, especially the United States. But Sadat was not gambling. Behind the Egyptian front lines stood the impressive SAM missile wall, a dense layer of surface-to-air defenses ready to shred Israeli aircraft. In fact, in just the first 3 days of the war, Israel lost around 60 fighter jets, representing roughly a quarter of its operational air force, despite being on the defensive. Had Israel launched the first strike, the results would likely have been the same, except Sadat would have emerged as a global statesman fighting in self-defense against aggression. In a 2011 interview with Ma'arif, Zvi Zamir recalled how, on October 12th, Ashraf Marwan contacted him again, this time from Cairo, warning that Egyptian armored divisions were preparing a breakthrough in Sinai. Zamir posed a critical question. If Marwan could phone the Mossad from Cairo during the war, why had he insisted on an in-person meeting in London just hours before it began? The answer lay in intent. It's true that Marwan made the call and delivered the warning, but the plan wasn't his. The voice was Marwan's. The mind was Sadat's. And with that, the third deception was set in motion. Sadat had instructed Marwan to warn the Israelis to revive his credibility, which had taken a hit following earlier false alerts. Marwan had served Egypt's war plans masterfully. But Sadat had further plans for him. With the conflict underway, he wanted Marwan to remain a trusted source, a tool not only for war but for the peace phase that would follow. And once again, Sadat was not taking military risks lightly. According to Egyptian General Staff reports, he had full confidence that Egyptian armor could successfully breach Israeli defenses in Sinai. This final act of misdirection wasn't a gamble. It was calculated, backed by both planning and confidence. In fact, Sadat had tested the same technique just 3 weeks earlier, in Rome. In September 1973, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi asked Sadat for help in avenging the downing of a Libyan passenger plane by Israel earlier that year. He asked Sadat for help in smuggling Libyan agents and missiles into Rome, with plans to shoot down an El Al airliner at the airport. Sadat approved the request, but with an ulterior motive. He tasked Ashraf Marwan with assisting the Libyans in their infiltration, and then, once again, he ordered Marwan to leak the plot to the Mossad, ensuring it would be foiled before anyone was harmed. It was another performance engineered to boost Marwan's credibility as a reliable source.
He was so upset that even I became very upset. And then he said, there was no one spy. We were a group of 40 people whose task it was to feed the Israelis. There was no single double agent. There was Egypt.
Aharon Bregman, the professor who revealed Ashraf Marwan's identity in 2002 and later offered to write his memoirs, recalled Marwan telling him, "I'm not Superman." The deception plan in 1973 was not carried out by me alone, but by many others as well. There was a team of 40 people whose mission was to feed the Israelis the conception, the belief that Egypt would not go to war before acquiring certain weapons. There was no single double agent. There was Egypt. According to Shimon Mendez, who served in the IDF Intelligence Directorate during the October War, bitterly observed, Sadat's Information Bureau prepared a poisonous dessert, and Marwan served it to us. And there are people among us that eat it delightfully to this very day. The Egyptian campaign is widely regarded as one of the most successful examples of strategic deception in modern military history. 50 years later, it remains a case study in military academies around the world, remarkable for achieving strategic surprise despite being under intense surveillance. Through calculated leaks, psychological manipulation, and meticulous planning, Egypt managed to outwit some of the world's most advanced intelligence services. As Eli Zera, former head of Israeli military intelligence, later admitted, the Egyptians deserved a commendation for bravery for their deception operation, which was executed with precision and secrecy that completely paralyzed Israel's intelligence apparatus.